Building an RGB gaming PC can be confusing and expensive if you don't know where to look. That's why in this video, I'm not just going to tell you which parts to get, but I'll also show you how to look for affordable parts all by yourself. First, you're going to need a part manager like PC Part Picker, which will help you organize all the parts you're finding so you can see the total price of your build at the very end. You're also going to be able to create separate lists with part modifications and compare the difference between the two builds. This is going to help you build the PC that best suits your needs while staying comfortably within your budget. Another reason you're going to want to use something like PC Part Picker is because you can easily share a link to the build and get feedback from communities on Reddit like the Build a PC subreddit. This is a community that's literally dedicated to giving you feedback before you buy your parts, so they can help you verify if you're getting the best price to performance and maybe offer some alternatives. One of my favorite communities is Build a PC Sales. It's an incredible subreddit because the people here are constantly sharing deals for everyone to take advantage of. I've saved a lot of money thanks to this subreddit, and I highly recommend that you subscribe to it and enable notifications so you don't miss out on any deals. You can even filter results by flare and look for the parts that you need. And if you ever come across some deals, then maybe consider sharing them on the subreddit because you could also help someone. I found some great deals on the subreddit for this build. First up was a Sapphire Pulse Radeon RX 6700 that comes with The Last of Us. For $280, this was a no-brainer for price to performance. A creator on YouTube called Random Gaming in HD made a great video all about this graphics card if you want to see it for yourself. I recommend you do your research on every part you're finding so you know if you're truly getting a good deal. Then I found a great fractal case that includes two 5V 3-pin RGB fans for only $70. Finding devices with 5V 3-pin ARGB headers is really important, and we're going to touch on that later. And finally, I found this 1TB Intel 670p SSD for only $42. Another amazing thing I discovered thanks to the Build a PC sales community is this massive SSD tier list that ranks over 400 SSDs so that you can make an informed decision. I'll be sure to leave a link to that in the video description. If you don't care about having new parts, then buying used parts is a great way to save money. Apps like OfferUp and Facebook Marketplace are my go-to for finding locally used parts. There's always a risk associated with buying used parts, but out of the roughly 50 purchases I've made, only one of them was a scam. If you're going to consider buying used parts, then the best advice I can give you is to always ask if you can test it thoroughly before buying. That's likely going to scare away anyone that's trying to scam you. Scammers look for someone that won't ask too many questions. You can even make up some BS about how you have a generator and a portable PC to test it with if they want you to meet in a public plaza. This is actually what I do.
Yeah, this is big brain time.
I also only buy used parts from people with high ratings because the chances are they won't risk getting their account banned for a petty scam. For this build, I got 16GB of 3600 MHz Corsair RGB RAM for only $40. The brand new price on Amazon for this RAM was $55, which is almost what they wanted to charge for their used set, so I was able to negotiate the price down. Some other good places to look for used parts would be websites like Jawa.gg, Mercari, and even eBay. Now, I personally don't like buying used parts I can't inspect first, so I stick to buying used parts locally. Another great way to save money is to buy open box or refurbished products on Amazon because it's usually still backed by a warranty and a return policy. Here's a great example with this Arctic Freezer A35 CPU cooler, which is only $28 used on Amazon. Unfortunately for me, that was for the Intel model and I needed the AMD model, which didn't have any used available, but this cooler is still a great price to performance and it includes addressable RGB, so I got it anyway. I did, however, save $10 on the Razer Chroma ARGB controller by getting it used. This controller is an essential part because it's going to allow you to bling out your PC with RGB without buying any of those premium overpriced RGB products. As long as your RGB devices are 5V 3-pin, then you can connect them to the controller. And that's what I'm going to be doing with the fans that came with the fractal case. I also purchased an additional 3 RGB fans from ID Cooling for only $25. That's also going to connect to this controller. That means that now all of these fans will be able to sync together easily inside of SignalRGB, which I'm going to demonstrate later. This saves a lot of money on RGB fans alone, and I'm still left with 1 port on the controller and 2 more ports on the motherboard, so that means I have room to connect 3 more ARGB devices. Speaking of motherboards, that brings me to my next point. If you're on a serious budget, then you definitely don't need a crazy motherboard to get the job done, especially if you don't plan to overclock. So for this build, I went with the Asus TUF A520M Plus, which includes Wi-Fi and the 2 ARGB headers I mentioned earlier. I saved $50 by going with this model over the ATX B550 model. That makes room in the budget to get a brand new 5600X 6-core 12-thread processor. For $150, this is a fantastic processor and it's going to pair nicely with the RX 6700 graphics card, which I'll show you during the benchmark later. Finally, you can save money on a power supply by using a power supply calculator, and I'll leave a link to that in the video description. This is going to tell you roughly how many watts you'll need. I don't recommend buying a super cheap off-brand power supply, but I also don't recommend buying a platinum power supply with 1000 watts if you're not actually going to need it. So calculate how much you're going to need after you know which parts you're using, And in my situation, I only needed a 600 watt power supply, so I got one from EVGA for 65 bucks, which is a reputable brand. Now with all the parts picked, let's have a look at the full list and total savings. First, I saved $85 on the graphics card and a key for The Last of Us. Then I saved 10 bucks on the case, which included 2 RGB fans, and the cost to fill up the rest of the case with RGB fans was only 25 bucks. So that's a case and 5 RGB fans for under $100. It's hard to say exactly how much I saved here, but to put it in perspective, if you were to buy only 3 QL RGB fans from Corsair, it would cost you more than I paid for a case and 5 RGB fans. The performance and noise level on the ID Cooling RGB fans is the same as the QL fans, so it's not like you're getting a lower quality either. That means that you definitely don't have to pay an insane premium just to have double-sided RGB fans. You can enjoy decent RGB and performance at affordable prices. After that, I saved $68 on a 1TB SSD, $15 on 16GB of RGB RAM, $10 on the Razer ARGB controller, and $50 by going with the A520M motherboard. That brings the total cost of this RGB PC to only $840. Now it's time to build the PC, and I'm going to show you how I wired the RGB and how I set it up in SignalRGB. The first thing I like to do at the start of any build is remove all of the panels to make the case lighter and easier to work with. After removing all of the panels, I usually install the power supply. If it was a modular power supply, I would also attach all the cables I would need now before putting it in the case. If you can spend more on a modular power supply, then I'd go with that because it will reduce how many cables you'll have to manage, but for the sake of this video, I wanted to show what the process would look like with a non-modular, affordable power supply. In this particular fractal case, you have to route the cables through this hole, so they end up on the back side of the case. Many higher-end cases have a shroud over this entire area, so you can't even see the power supply, and you wouldn't really need to route the cables like I am now. These are just some of the small conveniences that you sacrifice when you build a budget PC, but it's not really a deal breaker as you can see. Now it's time for the motherboard. It's good practice to put the RAM, CPU, and SSD in your motherboard before mounting it in the case. When you're working with 2 sticks of RAM, you should put them in slots 2 and 4. This is how you achieve a dual channel configuration for most motherboards. For the processor, always check where the golden triangle is and line that up with the triangle on the CPU socket. This basically makes it impossible to make a mistake. Finally, for the SSD, some motherboards like this one don't come with a standoff pre-installed, so you're going to need to grab it from the motherboard box. It looks like this. Then you screw that into the correct hole depending on the size of your SSD. In this situation, it goes on the 3rd hole like so. Then you just plug the SSD into the slot, push it down, and screw it in. You should also take the time now to install your CPU cooler mounting hardware, which I forgot to do, so you're going to see me do it later in the video. If your motherboard doesn't have an IO shield installed by default, now is the time to install it. When I went to screw it in, I also realized that I made a rookie mistake, and I forgot to put the standoffs in the correct positions for this micro ATX motherboard. There needs to be one standoff here and one here. I'm going to take these 2 standoffs and move them over to the correct spot. Now I can finally screw the motherboard in. Next, I like to connect all of the essential cables to the motherboard. So that would be the 24-pin cable, the USB cable, the HD audio cable, the F panel connectors, and the CPU cable. Then I zip tie all of it as best as I can so the cables aren't a total mess before moving on to the rest of the build. Don't stress yourself too much over cable management, just do a good enough job so you can close the back panel later. I'm going to mount the Razer ARGB controller right here using double-sided mounting tape. I find it pretty stupid that they can include these stickers, but they don't include any mounting tape. Good thing I have my own. Now I just have to connect the USB and power cable. I'd like to have a word with whoever invented this Molex connector. The 5V 3-pin RGB headers of the two fractal fans connect onto port 1 and 2 of the Razer controller. Then I connected one fan to the pins labeled channel_fan 2. And since these fans include a splitter, I connected the second fan to the first fan, so they're both connected to the same pins. Then I quickly went to plug the Razer controller's USB cable into the motherboard and finished it off with some zip ties to manage the cables. Now it's time to install the other 3 RGB fans. You always want to run the cables through to the back of the case first before mounting the fans. I also like to leave the screws slightly loose so I can position my fans where I want them, and then I tighten the screws. Then I connected the 5V 3-pin RGB headers of these 3 fans onto ports 3, 4, and 5 of the Razer controller. Conveniently, these fans come with a 1:3 fan splitter, so I connected that splitter to the pins labeled channel_fan 1 and connected the 3 fans to the fan splitter. And just like before, I finished it off with some zip ties to manage the cables. The second to last piece of the puzzle is the CPU cooler. First, I had to swap out the mounting hardware that comes stock with this motherboard, and then I added thermal paste and mounted the cooler. Finally, the fan connects to the pins labeled CPU_fan, and the 5V 3-pin cable will connect to port 6 on the Razer controller. The graphics card always goes in at the very end as the final piece of the puzzle. Then I just went to the back of the case to quickly zip tie the excess GPU power cable, and this PC is finished. Inside of SignalRGB, you will need to configure what devices are connected where. I know that everything is connected to the one Razer controller, which makes it super easy. Unfortunately, at the time of this video, we didn't have any pre-made components for these specific fans and the cooler that was used in this build, but that's fine. SignalRGB lets you create a custom strip for each channel. You just need to know how many LEDs are in each device. Channel 1 is the fractal fan, and I know that because it's pulsing red, which you can see here, and I also know that it has 5 LEDs, so I'll add a custom strip of 5 LEDs. Channel 2 is also a fractal fan pulsing in blue, and it also has 5 LEDs. Channel 3 is an ID cooling fan, which you can't see, but it's here at the top of the case and it has 10 LEDs, so I'll create a custom strip of 10 LEDs. Channel 4 pulsing in yellow is the CPU cooler. It has 11 LEDs. And the last two channels, 5 and 6, are also ID cooling fans, which are 10 LEDs. Here's how the final configuration looks. There's more you'll need to set up in the Layouts tab, but you can learn all about that in our official tutorial video, which I'll link in the description of this video. Now let's do a quick montage of SignalRGB effects. Now it's time for a quick benchmark using 3D Mark. I scored 10,334. The estimated performance for games like Battlefield and Apex Legends at 1440p Ultra was over 100 FPS. The temperatures were also pretty solid. The highest the CPU hit was about 60 Celsius. Overall, I think this is a solid RGB PC for $840. Alright, this is the end of the video, and I hope you guys learned a thing or two about how to build a decent gaming PC with RGB without giving up an arm and a leg. In this video, I was just focusing on the PC parts, but you can still use all of these methods to find deals on peripherals like mice and keyboards. Just the other week, I saw this insane deal on the Build a PC sales subreddit for a Razer mouse, keyboard, headset, and mousepad for only $40. And even if you're not a fan of Razer, that's still a damn good deal. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for the next video.